The call came at 3 a.m., dragging me from a restless sleep where gray, featureless figures reached out to me from lunar dust. I, Alex Richards, a life support systems engineer at AstroCorp Dynamics, was used to odd schedules, but this call was out of the ordinary. The voice on the other end, belonging to Director Thorne, my immediate superior, was strained and devoid of pleasantries. Richards, urgent situation at Artemis Prime. Critical cascading failure in life support systems. Need your expertise. Immediately. Artemis Prime. A cutting-edge research station on the moon, shrouded in such a layer of secrecy that it was more legend than fact. I knew that AstroCorp had interest there, but the details were hidden even from leading engineers like myself. Cascading failure? What exactly went wrong, sir? I asked, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. Details at the briefing. Transport shuttle awaits at Edwards AFB. Departure in 4 hours. And Richards, this is an Omega-7 level mission. Total secrecy. Click. Short beeps. Omega-7 meant I couldn't even hint to my wife where I was going. It meant the situation was more serious than a simple broken oxygen recycler. Questions buzzed in my head. A cascading failure was no joke. It could mean the complete loss of the station if not addressed quickly. But why such haste, such secrecy? The briefing in the sterile conference room at Edwards AFB was short and appallingly formal. Director Thorne, usually a talkative man with a developing paunch, was pale today and avoided my gaze. He merely repeated the phrases, critical life support system malfunction, and necessity of your unique field experience. To my attempts to clarify the nature of the malfunctions, obtain telemetry, or even get schematics of Artemis's specific modifications, he answered evasively. All data will be available on site. Your task is to stabilize the systems, at all costs. The atmosphere was so electrified it felt like the air crackled. I was issued a new encrypted communicator and a standard set of engineering gear, already packed. The flight to the moon aboard the experimental shuttle Odyssey 4 was tense. In the passenger compartment, designed for 6, there were only 2 of us. My companion turned out to be Mike Henderson, a young engineer intern who apparently had been assigned to me at the last moment. He was about 10 years younger than me, with a sparkle of enthusiasm in his eyes and a constant smile on his face. Apparently, this was the adventure of a lifetime for him. He tried to start a conversation, chattering facts about the moon, the shuttle, AstroCorp's latest developments. I answered in monosyllables, immersed in my thoughts. My experience told me that such urgent calls with this level of secrecy rarely portended anything good. Over the years at the corporation, I had seen all sorts, from accidents on orbital platforms to sabotage at Martian outposts. But this smelled of something else. Something wrong. We spent part of the journey in stasis pods. The dream returned to me. The gray figures, but this time, a predatory red glint flickered in their empty eye sockets, and I saw the outline of something resembling a huge wolf standing on its hind legs, its silhouette blackening against a dimly lit cave. I woke up with a pounding heart and an unpleasant feeling. Docking with Artemis Prime went smoothly. The station, unlike many older lunar bases, looked ultra-modern. Sleek, white modules connected by sealed corridors, brightly lit landing pads. But when we passed through the airlock, I immediately felt the tension. The welcoming party consisted of only 2 people. The head of security, a stern man named Graves, with a face carved from granite, and a technician in a standard jumpsuit who nervously fiddled with the edge of his tablet. No smiles, no usual greetings. The air in the airlock was sterile, smelling of ozone and something else. barely perceptible, metallic and musty, like an ancient, unventilated underground chamber. The artificial gravity, slightly weaker than Earth's, pressed comfortably on my feet after 0G. The station hummed as a large mechanism should, but there was a disturbing note in that hum, a hidden vibration you felt in your gut rather than your ears. Graves gave a curt nod. "Richards, Henderson, welcome to Artemis Prime. Your habitat modules are ready. Security protocol briefing in 10 minutes in your sector. Follow me." His voice was level, but his eyes, there was a hidden weariness in them, and something else I couldn't identify then. Something like fear. The station inside was a labyrinth of corridors lined with light gray panels. Bright LED strips on the ceiling cast sharp shadows. We met few people, and the few who did cross our path quickly averted their eyes and hurried past. A sense of secrecy and unspoken truths hung in the air thicker than the lunar dust beyond the viewports. I looked at Mike. Even his usual enthusiasm seemed to have waned. He silently followed Graves, eyes wide, trying to keep up. As for me, I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the comfortable 70-degree Fahrenheit temperature. Something very wrong was happening at Artemis Prime, and I was beginning to understand that the critical cascading failure of life support systems was just the tip of a very dark and very deep iceberg. The station's security chief, Graves, turned out to be a man of few words. His face, etched with fine wrinkles, spoke of years of service, perhaps in some special forces, before he settled here on this dusty sphere. He led us to our habitat modules, standard cabins about 10 by 12 feet, with a bunk, built-in terminal, and a small bathroom. Functional, sterile, impersonal. At the briefing, Graves dryly outlined the protocols, access levels, procedures for various emergencies, specifically emphasizing the list of restricted areas. Sector Gamma, the research wing, was highlighted in red. Especially important work is being conducted there, he stated, looking somewhere past us. No entry without special authorization and escort. Not a step. My first meeting with Dr. Evelyn Reed took place the next day. She came herself to the engineering section where I had already set up my diagnostic tools. Reed was a woman in her 40s, with short-cropped dark hair showing streaks of gray and piercing, intelligent eyes. She wore a lab coat over a standard jumpsuit. She exuded energy and a kind of feverish obsession. "Mr. Richards, I am Dr. Evelyn Reed, lead xenoarchaeologist for the project," she introduced herself, extending a hand. Her handshake was firm, almost masculine. "I'm glad you're here. We desperately need your help stabilizing the power systems for a unique geological specimen." "A geological specimen?" I repeated, trying to keep a neutral expression. Something in her manner, in the way her eyes sparkled at the mention of the specimen, put me on alert. She was clearly hiding something, concealing something larger behind scientific terms. "Yes, very unusual," she nodded, but quickly changed the subject. "Your skills in resonant energy flows will be invaluable. Graves said you're the best." The flattery was clumsy, but I ignored it. I began working on repairing the life support systems. I deployed my analyzers, connected to the main consoles, and the deeper I delved into Artemis Prime's schematics and logs, the greater my bewilderment grew. The main systems, air regeneration, water purification, temperature control, were working almost perfectly. There were minor fluctuations, a couple of faulty sensors that I calibrated in a couple of hours, but nothing that could cause a critical cascading failure and necessitate calling a specialist from Earth. My work felt increasingly like a cover-up, as if I had been called here under false pretenses, and the real reason for my presence was different. And then I noticed it. unusual, sharp spikes in power consumption coming from Sector Gamma. They were masked in the system logs, rerouted through several buffer substations, but my experience allowed me to see such things. Someone was trying very hard to hide the true scale of energy usage in that research wing. These weren't just kilowatts, they were megawatts. Peak loads capable of blacking out a small city. What the hell were they doing in there? Mike, my young partner, proved useful. While I was buried in the systems, he, using his sociability, tried to get the few technical staff members to talk. And he succeeded. That evening, in our cabin, he lowered his voice and told me he had overheard snippets of conversations in the mess hall. Mentions of the Tycho crater find, the artifact, strange signals. Someone said that Reed has completely lost it with her thing, and another whispered that strange sounds come from Gamma at night, like scraping. Tycho crater, I repeated thoughtfully. One of the most famous and geologically interesting places on the moon. Curiosity mixed with growing apprehension. I felt like a character in a cheap detective novel stumbling upon a conspiracy. The dreams became more frequent and vivid. Now it wasn't just gray figures flickering. I saw dark, winding caves lit by a crimson light. I heard a low, guttural growl that chilled me to the bone. And always, the feeling of being watched by an unseen, intense gaze. One day, passing the smoking room, a small sealed compartment where staff could indulge in that unhealthy habit, I overheard two technicians discussing a recent incident in hushed tones. Another spike. Ben almost wet himself when the instruments went off the charts. Says it was like it breathed. Come on, that's just static. But Reed was furious we couldn't maintain the voltage. I slowed my pace, trying not to show my interest. Ben. I had heard that name before. He was one of Dr. Reed's assistants, I think. Tension on the station grew daily. People became even more withdrawn, their faces drawn dark circles under their eyes. Even the usually optimistic Mike was downcast. The atmosphere of secrecy and suppressed fear thickened like storm clouds before a tempest. I knew something was going to happen soon, and that something was directly connected to the mysterious find from Sector Gamma. I had to find out what it was, even if it meant disobeying Graves' direct orders. The stakes were too high, and my engineering intuition screamed danger. Another 2 days passed, filled with routine, mostly meaningless work checking already functional systems. My requests for access to Sector Gamma, submitted under the pretense of needing a full energy consumption diagnostic, were invariably rejected by Graves with a short note. Denied. No necessity. But I felt Dr. Reed watching me. A couple of times I caught her scrutinizing, tense gaze when we crossed paths in the corridors or in the common mess hall. And so, on the third day, when I had already begun contemplating more unorthodox ways to get into the forbidden wing, the communicator on my wrist beeped. Dr. Reed's voice, dry and businesslike, but with a barely noticeable tremor of impatience, announced, "Mr. Richards, your assistance is required in Sector Gamma. Calibration of the climate control systems and stabilization of the electromagnetic field around the experimental zone are needed. Urgently." The excuse was ludicrous. The climate control in a research lab was automated and heavily redundant. But this was my chance. I grabbed my toolkit, gestured to Mike, who immediately perked up, and we headed towards Sector Gamma. The journey there felt like descending into the underworld. Several massive sealed doors with keypads and retina scanners, which Graves, who was accompanying us with 2 guards, silently opened. Beyond each door, the temperature seemed to drop a couple of degrees, and the air became thicker, heavier with a strange, barely perceptible smell. A mix of ozone, burnt wiring, and something else. Something ancient, like the dust of millennia-old tombs. The silence here was almost absolute, broken only by the echo of our steps on the metal floor and a distant low-frequency hum whose source I couldn't identify. Finally, we stood before the last door, massive like a bank vault entrance. Graves swiped his card, then underwent a retinal scan. With a heavy pneumatic sigh, the door slid aside, opening into a vast, dimly lit laboratory. And I saw it. It stood in the center of the hall, on a special pedestal, surrounded by complex equipment and cables running into the floor and ceiling. A statue, but that word seemed too simple, too mundane for what lay before my eyes. It was carved from absolutely black, matte stone, resembling obsidian, yet the stone seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Standing no less than 8, perhaps 9 feet tall, the statue depicted something anthropomorphic, yet distorted, monstrous. Long, disproportionate limbs with huge, clawed paws, a powerful torso covered in relief-like ropes, resembling either muscles or dried tendons, and the head of a wolf, but demonic from a nightmare. A snarling maw filled with rows of thin, needle-like teeth, capable of tearing flesh with ease. And the eye sockets were empty, but in their depths a darkness swirled so dense that it seemed to draw in your gaze, and I was certain, that these empty sockets were watching my every move. A faint chill emanated from the statue, not physical, but an inner coldness that seeped into my bones, and a feeling of ancient, inhuman malice, so concentrated it made my throat constrict. Mike beside me let out a quiet, strangled sound, like a sob, and involuntarily took a step back. I didn't blame him. An irrational primal terror seized me, a desire to turn and flee without looking back. Dr. Reed stood next to the statue, gazing at it with an expression I might have called reverence, were it not for the sheer madness in her eyes. She turned to us, and in the dim light her eyes gleamed. "Here it is, Mr. Richards. Our find. We extracted it from a recently opened lava tube deep within the Tycho crater. Radiocarbon analysis of the material yielded no results. It defies dating by known methods. But the surrounding geological layers indicate an age of at least several 100,000 years, possibly millions." Her voice trembled with excitement. "It emits unique energy signatures, low-frequency pulses, complex wave packets. We are trying to decipher them, understand the nature of this artifact, perhaps even activate it." Activate it? Cold sweat ran down my spine. This thing did not look like something you should activate. It looked like the quintessence of pure evil solidified in stone. "Do you understand what this could mean, Mr. Richards?" Reed continued, her voice growing more fervent. "This is proof of an ancient, non-human civilization, right here on the moon. This will overturn all our understanding of the universe, of our place in it." I stepped closer, trying to fight the inner tremor. On the statue's surface, if you looked closely, you could discern faint, almost erased patterns. Not writing, but rather complex geometric symbols that seemed to slightly shift shape when I looked away. A faint smell emanated from the statue, like ozone after a thunderstorm mixed with something else. Something metallic and bitter, like blood. My head began to ache slightly, and an unpleasant knot formed in my stomach. "Dr. Reed," I began, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, "what specific issues are you experiencing with power supply or climate control? Based on the readings at the sector entrance, all systems are operating normally." She waved a hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Those are details, Mr. Richards. We need absolute stability for the next phase of the experiment. Any power surge, any deviation in the electromagnetic background could distort the results. Your task is to ensure that stability." I looked at Mike. He was pale as a sheet and tried to stay close to me, away from the statue. Then I looked back at the carving. The feeling of irrational fear and revulsion didn't subside. On the contrary, it intensified with every minute spent in this hall. I attributed it to fatigue, to the unusual situation, to the oppressive atmosphere of the station. But somewhere deep down, an icy premonition stirred that we were standing on the threshold of something terrible. And this black, wolf-like statue was the key to that horror. The next few days were spent in feverish preparation for what Dr. Reed called the active resonant interaction phase. Essentially, they were going to bombard the statue with a concentrated beam of modulated energy, trying to elicit a response to wake it up. As one of Reed's assistants, a young woman named Sarah with eager eyes, put it, Mike and I were assigned to ensure the seamless operation of the experimental setup. My task was to make sure the station's power system could handle the colossal loads required to generate the necessary beam. I installed extra capacitors, laid new power cables, and rewrote energy distribution algorithms. Every fiber of my being protested against this. It was like holding a match to a powder keg, not knowing how much powder was inside or how strong the explosion would be. A nervous excitement filled the laboratory in Sector Gamma. Dr. Reed and her team, including the aforementioned Ben, a young, enthusiastic assistant I had briefly seen before, barely slept, constantly checking instrument readings, adjusting the emitter parameters. Ben seemed to be Reed's right-hand man. He carried out all her orders with enthusiasm, his face alight with anticipation of a great discovery. Mike and I were positioned in the adjoining control room, separated from the main lab hall by a thick, reinforced plexiglass window, supposedly capable of withstanding a small explosion. From here, we could observe what was happening and monitor all energy flows. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mike kept nervously wiping his sweaty palms on his jumpsuit. I tried to maintain an outward calm, but inside, everything tightened with a sense of foreboding. The dreams of the wolf shadow in the cave became almost real, and each time I woke up in a cold sweat. "All systems ready, Alex," Mike reported, his voice slightly trembling. "Capacitors charged to 100%. Emitter on standby." I nodded, checking the readings on my console. "Got it. Keep your hand on the emergency kill switch. If anything goes wrong, shut everything down. Don't wait for my command." "Yes, boss." In the lab, Dr. Reed took her place at the main emitter control console. Her face was focused, almost predatory. "Beginning countdown," her voice came over the internal comms, clear and confident, but with the same note of feverish excitement I had noticed at our first meeting. 10, 9. I watched the statue. It stood motionless, black and menacing, absorbing the dim lab light. It seemed to mock our pathetic attempts to comprehend its essence. 3, 2, 1. Engage! With a low hum, the emitter powered up. A barely visible flickering beam of energy shot out from its nozzle, aimed precisely at the center of the statue. The lights in the lab dimmed slightly. Colossal power was being drawn to fuel the setup. I monitored the readings on my console. Power consumption spiked to critical levels, but the systems were holding for now. The seconds stretched out agonizingly. The statue did not react at all. It simply absorbed the energy like a black hole. I had already begun to think that nothing would happen, that this was just another expensive, pointless endeavor by obsessed scientists. "Increase power by 20%, Reed commanded. Ben, standing near one of the sensors next to the statue, quickly entered the command on his tablet. The beam intensified, the air around it shimmering with tension. And then it started. First, a low, barely audible hum that seemed to originate not from the equipment, but from the statue itself. It grew, getting louder, turning into a vibration that traveled through the deck of the control room, making the instruments on my desk rattle. The lights in the lab began to flicker more violently. "What's happening?" Mike exclaimed, gripping the armrests of his chair. "Keep that kill switch ready," I shouted, not taking my eyes off the statue. And at that moment, the empty eye sockets of the carving flared. A bright crimson, unbearable light that made me instinctively squint. It wasn't just light. It was a kind of concentrated malice erupting. A powerful infrasound pulse swept through the station, making my ears pop and momentarily blacking out my vision. The system indicators on my console flashed red multiple failures, overloads, short circuits. "Dr. Reed! Stop the experiment!" I yelled into the microphone, but there was no response. Chaos erupted in the lab. Instruments sparked, some panels exploded in showers of sparks. Assistants scattered in panic, trying to find cover. And then I saw Ben. He was standing closest to the statue, just a few feet away. When the carving's eyes flared, he clutched his head, letting out a wild, inhuman scream. A scream that contained nothing but primal terror and agony. Then he collapsed to the floor as if struck down. His body began to contort unnaturally, limbs jerking convulsively, breaking at impossible angles. I watched as his fingers curled, lengthening, turning into claws. Mike beside me let out a strangled groan. I was frozen, riveted by the horror, unable to tear my gaze away from the monstrous metamorphosis unfolding beyond the thick plexiglass. The ancient nightmare from my dreams was coming to life. Ben's transformation was a horrific spectacle, ripped straight from the darkest depths of a sick imagination. It happened with terrifying speed, accompanied by sounds that curdled the blood. I heard the distinct crunch of bones breaking and realigning, the wet tearing of flesh. His jumpsuit burst open at the back, and thick bluish-black fur began to sprout from it like repulsive weeds. Ben's face contorted, stretching into a bestial muzzle. His jaws snapped open, revealing elongating, needle-sharp fangs. His eyes, a moment ago full of human terror, became bloodshot and flared with the same crimson fire as the statue's eye sockets. In just about half a minute, where a young, enthusiastic scientist had been, something at least 7 feet tall was writhing on the floor and then slowly rising onto its hind legs. A grotesque, stiff-furred creature, with powerful clawed paws and a distorted wolf's head, vaguely resembled the statue that stood in the center of the hall, now dimly glowing with its internal light. It raised its head to the lab ceiling and howled. But it was not the howl of an ordinary wolf. It was a soul-chilling, prolonged sound, full of unspeakable rage, pain, and some ancient alien sorrow. A sound that seemed to penetrate the skin, vibrate in the bones, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Even through the thick plexiglass, it was deafening. The creature that was Ben froze for a moment, as if listening to something, and then, with incredible speed and agility impossible for such a mass, lunged at the nearest scientist, the same Sarah who had spoken so excitedly about awakening. Her scream cut off mid-sentence, drowning in a gurgling choke. I saw a clawed paw swipe her against the wall with a single blow, leaving a crimson smear on the white plastic. Hell broke loose in the lab. Panic was absolute. The remaining scientists and technicians screamed and scattered, trying to find cover, but there were few exits. and the creature moved with terrifying speed, cutting off escape routes. Sporadic panicked shots rang out. Apparently, someone from the station's security was nearby and had service weapons, most likely standard energy pistols. But the bright discharges only momentarily stopped the monster, leaving smoking burns on its hide that seemed to instantly heal. This only enraged it further. I searched for Dr. Reed with my eyes. She stood at her console, hands clasped over her mouth, her face white as chalk. But in her wide, staring eyes, beyond the terror, I saw something else. Something monstrous, that same insane, investigative gleam. She wasn't trying to run. She was watching the transformed Ben, watching the bloody massacre. And I was ready to swear that I saw her fingers tremble as they pressed buttons on the panel, as if she was trying to record data or log the events. It was beyond my comprehension. Alex, what do we do?" Mike's voice broke me out of my stupor. He was deathly pale, trembling. "We're leaving, immediately." I grabbed his arm. We had to get out of here before that thing, or others if they appeared, reached the control room. I slammed the button for emergency door sealing into the lab. The heavy steel plate hissed as it slid down, cutting us off from the bloody chaos. But the howling didn't stop. It only became muffled, continuing to assault our ears. "Emergency exit! It should be in the service corridor behind this wall," I shouted, remembering the station schematics. We rushed to an inconspicuous door in the corner of the control room. Luckily, it wasn't locked. Beyond the door was a narrow, dimly lit technical tunnel. We ran blindly, stumbling over cables and pipes, guided only by emergency exit signs. Behind us from the lab, muffled screams, growling, and sounds of struggle still echoed. The station's sirens were now wailing non-stop, their alarming blare mixing with the monster's howl, creating a cacophony of pure horror. "Where are we running?" Mike gasped out of breath. "To our modules, or some engineering section we can seal off tight. We need to barricade ourselves in and try to contact Earth," I replied, though I had little hope of communication. If the experiment had caused such extensive failures, the communication systems were likely down too. We burst into one of the main corridors. It was empty, but fresh, dark stains resembling blood were visible on the floor. Emergency lights flickered. The feeling of being pursued never left me. It seemed like behind every corner, behind every closed door, another such monster could be lurking. We raced down the corridors, our steps echoing in the silence that had fallen, broken only by the wailing sirens and the distant yet still audible, horrifying howl from Sector Gamma. The first howl of an awakened ancient horror, and I feared it wouldn't be the last. That howl marked the beginning of the end for Artemis Prime, and perhaps not just for her. We reached our habitat block, gasping for breath and barely standing. The corridor here was just as empty and silent, except for the continuous wail of the emergency alarm. I frantically punched the code into my cabin's panel. Thankfully, the electronics were still working. We stumbled inside, and I immediately activated the manual door locking system. Heavy steel bolts slammed into their slots with a dull thud. "Mike, grab that bunk! And the table! Anything we can move to the door!" I commanded, trying to catch my breath. Adrenaline still surged through my veins, but my hands trembled from the terror I had experienced. We worked silently and quickly, barricading the door with everything in the small cabin. The metal bunk, a lightweight plastic table, even the toolboxes I had brought from the engineering section. It was a flimsy barricade, but it provided at least the illusion of security. Finished, we listened. Sounds from outside, from the depths of the station, sent shivers down our spines. Growling, similar to what the transformed Ben had made, was interspersed with distant screams that quickly cut off. Sometimes, short, panicked bursts of energy weapon fire could be heard, followed by dull thuds, as if something heavy was hitting walls or falling to the floor. The system communicator on my wrist briefly came alive, reporting loss of contact with various station sectors. The medical bay, hydroponics lab, command center. One by one, they fell silent. Artemis Prime was descending into darkness and chaos. Thus began our siege. The first few hours we spent in tense silence, listening to every sound. Then the sounds from outside began to approach. We heard heavy, shuffling footsteps in the corridor, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Something huge and strong was scraping at our door, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Then came a powerful impact that made the door shudder and our makeshift barricade groan. Mike cried out and recoiled. I grabbed the heaviest wrench from my toolkit, a pathetic weapon against what was out there. But it was better than nothing. The attacks continued for about 10 minutes. Then the creature, whoever it was, apparently lost interest and retreated, leaving us in a trembling silence, broken only by our own ragged breathing. A week passed, or maybe more. Time in the confined space, in constant fear, flowed differently. The emergency supplies of food, high-calorie protein bars, and water, which I had prudently stored in my cabin in case of unforeseen circumstances, were running low. We rationed them as much as possible, but hunger and thirst became increasingly palpable. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The fear of the unknown, of what lurked behind the door, mixed with claustrophobia and despair. We barely slept, startling at every noise. Periodically, the creatures returned. There were several of them, judging by the different types of growls and scrapes. They pounded fiercely at the door, testing its strength, sometimes circling nearby for hours. I constantly reinforced the barricade, using anything I could find. Once, through a narrow gap under the door, I saw a fleeting shadow, a huge clawed paw, covered in dark fur. I tried to repair my communicator to contact Earth, or at least other survivors if there were any. But the airwaves were dead. Only the hiss of static, through which sometimes I thought distorted, inhuman voices broke through, whispers or a distant howl. As if the station itself was infected with this madness, this ancient evil. The module's power was holding on emergency batteries, but they wouldn't last forever either. The lights dimmed with each passing day. Mike was holding on by a thread. He barely spoke, sitting staring blankly or quietly crying when he thought I wasn't looking. I tried to encourage him, telling him help would surely come, that we wouldn't be abandoned. But deep down, I barely believed it myself. Who would come to a dead, infected station? My dreams became even more nightmarish. Now I didn't just see the wolf demon. I felt its presence, its icy breath on my skin. I wandered through endless dark corridors of Artemis Prime, pursued by a pack of these creatures, their red eyes glowing in the darkness. Sometimes in my dream, I saw the statue. It stood in the ruined laboratory, and its crimson eyes stared directly at me, promising something worse than death. One day, when the water supply was almost gone and hunger was almost unbearable, I heard a new sound. It was different from the usual growling and scraping. It was the sound of working engines, and then a distinct metallic screech and a dull thud, like a ship docking with the station's airlock. Hope, weak and trembling, flared in my chest. Could it be rescue? But following the docking sounds, almost immediately other sounds erupted, the sounds of battle. But this was not the panicked shooting of staff. It was the clear, powerful discharges of heavy weaponry, short bursts, explosions. Someone was engaged in an organized fight against the creatures. The cavalry had arrived. The only question was whether this cavalry would turn out to be another prelude to the nightmare. I gripped the wrench until my knuckles were white and braced myself for the worst. New sounds filled the station, sounds that simultaneously instilled hope and bone-chilling terror. This wasn't the chaotic gunfire of doomed Artemis Prime personnel, but the methodical, furious work of professionals. Powerful, booming shots that vibrated the bulkheads of our refuge were interspersed with the characteristic crackle of pulse rifles and dull explosions, likely grenades. Added to the growling and howling of the creatures were dying shrieks and choked sounds. It seemed the unwelcome visitors were bringing death not only to them. Mike and I froze, listening. The battle seemed to be happening somewhere in the central sectors of the station, but it gradually shifted, approaching our block. Who could it be? A rescue mission from Earth? Or some corporate cleanup crew sent by AstroCorp to bury the evidence of the disaster? Either way, their arrival meant our isolation was over. The only question was what awaited us next. Suddenly, the door to our cabin shuddered from a monstrous impact, much stronger than those the creatures had delivered. The barricade groaned, the table shifted a couple of inches. Mike and I recoiled to the far wall. Then came a high-pitched, ear-splitting whine. A plasma cutter. A bright, blinding arc swept across the perimeter of the door, leaving behind a smoking, melted trail. I shielded my eyes with my hand. The air filled with the smell of burnt metal and ozone. A moment later, the cut section of the door fell inward with a crash, raising a cloud of dust. In the opening against the backdrop of the dimly lit corridor stood two massive figures. They were clad in heavy, dark gray combat exoskeletons, bearing the insignia of the U.S. Space Force on their shoulder pads. In their hands, they held formidable-looking pulse rifles, their barrels pointed directly at us. Helmets with darkened visors concealed their faces. Alex Richards? Mike Henderson? A voice, amplified and slightly distorted by a helmet speaker, but authoritative, rang out from one of the soldiers' helmets. It was calm, businesslike, not a hint of surprise or sympathy. I swallowed hard. Yes, that's us. Captain Marcus Cole, Cerberus Quick Response Team. Orders to evacuate survivors. Grab your belongings if anything is valuable. We have little time. Move. Mike seemed about to say something, but I nudged him in the side. No time for questions. Do as they say. We quickly gathered the remnants of our meager supplies, mostly my engineering toolkit and a couple of water canteens, which the soldiers immediately told us to leave behind, assuring us there was everything aboard the shuttle. Stay behind us, keep up, and don't do anything foolish. Captain Cole tossed over his shoulder, and his squad, consisting of himself and 3 other soldiers, moved down the corridor. Mike and I hurried after them, trying not to get in their way. The path to the evacuation shuttle turned into a nightmarish journey through the devastated and blood-soaked corridors of Artemis Prime. Walls were covered in blast marks from weapons and deep gouges from claws. Mutilated bodies of station personnel lay on the floor, some torn apart with inhuman brutality. Next to them occasionally lay the corpses of the creatures, huge black-furred carcasses riddled with energy blasts. The soldiers moved quickly and cohesively, their exoskeletons allowing them to carry heavy weaponry and armor without losing speed. They operated like a well-oiled machine, covering each other, checking every corner. A couple of times we had to engage in combat. The creatures appeared suddenly, leaping from dark side corridors or smashing through thin bulkheads. They were incredibly fast and strong. Their claws tore through metal with ease. But Cole's soldiers were ready. Their pulse rifles spewed torrents of deadly energy, throwing the monsters back, shredding their flesh. The air filled with the smell of burnt fur and ozone. I saw one of the soldiers covering our rear attacked by an unusually large creature. The monster's claws screeched across his chest armor, leaving deep scratches and tearing out chunks of ceramite. The soldier staggered back but immediately responded with an accurate burst to the creature's head, obliterating its skull. He swore under his breath, checking the damage on his armor, and resumed his position. I tried not to look at the mangled bodies, at the signs of the carnage, but the images of that hell were seared into my memory forever. Mike walked beside me, pale, eyes wide with horror, but he held on, apparently understanding that any hesitation could cost us our lives. Captain Cole led us confidently, as if he knew this station like the back of his hand, though I doubted he had ever been here before. He likely had detailed schematics. His orders were short and clear. The soldiers obeyed them without question. In their movements, in the way they handled their weapons, there was a sense of vast combat experience. These guys weren't just soldiers. They were elite, killing machines built for operations like this in hell. And I couldn't shake the thought, were they here only to rescue us? Or did they have other, more important objectives? They were too well prepared, too professional in their actions, as if they expected to encounter this exact level of threat. My engineering logic told me something didn't add up. But now was not the time for contemplation. The main thing was to get out of this lunar nightmare alive. After what felt like an endless journey through the station's bloody labyrinths, we finally emerged into the main hangar bay, where the heavy shuttle landing pad was located. The vast space was partially destroyed. A gaping hole in one wall offered a view of the lifeless lunar surface and distant stars. There were also signs of fierce fighting here. Mangled loaders, bloodstains on the concrete floor, several corpses of the creatures abandoned in the corners. In the center of the hangar, ready for launch, stood a massive Space Force transport shuttle, its ramp lowered, faint wisps of steam emanating from its engine nozzles. Around the shuttle, several other soldiers in exoskeletons were on guard, their weapons ready. And then, right at the ramp, I saw her. Dr. Evelyn Reed. She was pale, her lab coat torn and stained with something dark, her hair disheveled. But she was alive. Two soldiers from Cole's group stood near her, more as guards than as escorts. Reed held a protected datapad in her hands, and she was talking to Captain Cole, who had just joined her feverishly, almost breathless, pointing at the screen of the tablet. "The data is invaluable, Captain. We were on the verge of a fundamental discovery. The signatures we recorded before the incident, they indicate the possibility of controlled interaction. This isn't just an artifact, it's a key." Her voice was high and tense, with hints of fanaticism. Cole listened silently. His face, hidden by his helmet, showed no emotion. But I noticed him slightly tilt his head, as if assessing her words, or perhaps her herself. A bad feeling washed over me. Something about Dr. Reed's appearance was wrong, disturbing. Her eyes, they gleamed too brightly, almost feverishly. There wasn't a trace of grief for her dead colleagues, nor fear of the nightmare she had survived. Only this obsession, this mad fervor. Her posture was unnaturally rigid, her fingers convulsively gripping the datapad. She kept casting quick, furtive glances towards the dark, sealed corridor which, I knew, led back to Sector Gamma, to the statue. On her neck, near the collar of her jumpsuit, I noticed a fresh, deep scratch, as if from claws. "Doctor, we appreciate your scientific dedication," Cole said in a level voice when she paused for a breath. "But the main priority now is evacuation. Your data will be transferred to the relevant specialists on Earth." "But you don't understand." Reed almost shrieked, her face contorted. "This can't just be transferred. It needs to be studied here, controlled." I know how." And at that moment I felt the same icy coldness, the same primal revulsion I had experienced in the lab before the statue. It was coming from Reed. Captain Cole made a subtle gesture to one of his soldiers. "Time to board, Doctor." Reed flinched back. "No, you won't take this from me. This isn't a curse, it's a gift. The next step in evolution." Her voice began to change, becoming lower, harsher, acquiring a growling quality. Her back arched, a faint cracking sound was heard. The fingers gripping the data pad began to lengthen, her nails sharpening, blackening. The transformation happened before our eyes, and it was even faster and more horrific than Ben's, as if her body was already prepared, as if this process was familiar to her. Dark fur instantly covered her skin, her face stretched into a bestial muzzle. But in her eyes, glowing with crimson light, a flicker of that same insane human intellect remained, making her even more terrifying. She wasn't just turning into a mindless monster. She was becoming something worse, a sentient predator. With a roar that made my ears ring, she flung the data pad away and leaped. But not at us. She lunged towards one of the surviving hangar control consoles, her clawed paws already reaching for the panel. Presumably she was trying to lock down the airlock, transmit some data, or activate the station's self-destruct system. Who knew what was going on in her altered consciousness? Captain Cole reacted instantly. "Fire! Eliminate the target!" His voice was cold and merciless. The soldiers surrounding her did not hesitate for a second. The pulse rifle blasts merged into a single roar. Reed's body, already halfway transformed into a monstrous shape, convulsed under the hail of energy discharges thrown back from the console. She fell to the floor, writhing and making horrible gurgling sounds. A few more precise shots to the head, and she was silent, a smoking, charred mass. I stood, stunned by the brutality and speed of what had just happened. Mike beside me let out a quiet moan and covered his face with his hands. Captain Cole lowered his rifle. "No unnecessary witnesses and no surprises on board," he said, as if commenting on the weather forecast. Then he turned to us. "To the shuttle. Immediately. Lifting off in 2 minutes." The serpent in this ruined Eden had been destroyed, but its poison, I felt, had already begun to spread, and I wasn't sure we were truly heading for salvation. "Everyone on board, move it," Captain Cole barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. Mike and I, still in shock from what we had just witnessed, stumbled up the ramp into the shuttle's troop bay. The soldiers followed us, their heavy boots clanking on the metal floor. The last one, after ensuring no one was left outside, pressed a button on the panel, and the ramp hissed shut, sealing us off from the nightmare of Artemis Prime. Inside, the shuttle was Spartanly equipped. Rows of rigid jump seats along the sides, dim emergency lighting, the smell of ozone and machine oil. Mike and I collapsed onto the nearest free seats. The soldiers quickly took their positions, buckling up. Captain Cole went into the cockpit, and a moment later the shuttle shuddered noticeably, the engines powering up. Then came a powerful thrust that pressed us into our seats. We were lifting off the lunar surface. I pressed my face to a small viewport. Artemis Prime rapidly shrunk in size, becoming a silver speck against the boundless blackness of space. studded with myriad stars. The station looked peaceful and lifeless from here, as if nothing terrible had happened there. But I knew what darkness lurked in its corridors, and then I saw them. Several dark points slowly approaching the station from the direction of Earth. As they drew closer, I could make out their shapes. They were ships, much larger than our shuttle. Military vessels without a doubt. Not rescue craft, but rather occupation force. They moved purposefully, forming a kind of blockade around Artemis Prime. "Captain," I turned to Cole, who had just emerged from the cockpit and was now buckling into his seat. "What are those ships? What are they going to do with the station? With what's left there?" Cole cast a brief glance at the viewport, then looked at me. Beneath the edge of his helmet, I saw weary, cynical eyes. "Standard procedure, Richards," he said in a level, emotionless voice. "The corporation, or whoever is behind all this, the government, they'll never give up such an asset. They will try to study it, isolate it, perhaps even control it. They'll try to understand how it works and put it to their service." "Put it to service?" I repeated, feeling an icy chill grip my insides. "You mean a weapon?" Cole gave a wry chuckle. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "And why not? Imagine a force capable of turning people into those things, a controllable force. It's the dream of any general, any government. Do you think they'll be stopped by some ethical considerations? Or a few dozen dead personnel? They're just collateral damage, Richards, expendable. The main thing is the potential gain, the power." His words hit me like hammer blows. The cold, ruthless logic of those who sit above, in safety, moving pieces on a chessboard without caring about the cost. I remembered the statue, its inhuman malice, the primal terror it radiated. The idea of studying this, controlling it, weaponizing it seemed to me the height of madness, playing with fire that could consume the whole world. "It should have been destroyed," I whispered, more to myself than to Cole. "The station, the statue, all of it should have been wiped to dust, blown to hell before it was too late." Mike, sitting beside me, shuddered and shrank further into his seat. He was pale, his eyes darting around the compartment in fear. He hadn't spoken since we left the station, as if the horror he had lived through had stolen his voice. Cole shrugged. "Maybe you're right, Richards. But that's not our call. We're just soldiers. We follow orders." He turned back to the viewport, signaling the conversation was over. I looked out the viewport too. Earth, our home, hung in the blackness of space, a glowing blue marble. So beautiful, so fragile. And I felt afraid. Afraid of the thought that human greed, human craving for power and destruction, might be stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. That the nightmare we left on the moon was just the beginning, and that this shuttle, carrying us away from Artemis Prime, might be bringing something worse than just survivors back to Earth. It was bringing the knowledge of this horror's existence. And knowledge, as they say, is power. A temptation hard to resist. A bitter taste of despair filled my mouth. We were flying home. But this return held no promise of relief. It was steeped in fear, and the premonition of a new, even more terrible calamity. The weight of what we had survived, and what we had perhaps unwittingly brought upon our world, pressed down with unbearable heaviness. The flight to Earth lasted several hours, which felt like an eternity. The adrenaline that had kept me going on Artemis Prime drained away, leaving behind a ringing emptiness, fatigue, and a latent, sticky fear. An oppressive silence filled the shuttle's bay, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and the ragged breathing of my companions. The soldiers sat motionless, staring straight ahead or out the viewports. Their faces, now without helmets, were stern and unreadable. Mike still said nothing, crouched in his seat, his gaze vacant and distant. I began to notice strange things. First, Mike. He was sweating heavily, despite the cool temperature in the cabin, which was maintained at around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Beads of sweat gleamed on his forehead. His hair was matted. He kept twitching, his fingers nervously fumbling with his seatbelt. His eyes shone feverishly, darting anxiously around, as if he was seeing something the others weren't. Then I noticed one of the soldiers, the one who had been injured by a creature in the corridor. He was sitting across from me, and I saw him furtively, trying not to attract attention, examining his arm beneath the edge of his armor. On his forearm were 4 deep inflamed scratches. The skin around them was unnaturally pale, almost blue-tinged, and covered in a network of thin, dark veins spreading from the wounds like a web. The soldier winced in pain when he accidentally brushed the wound. A chill ran down my spine. "Captain," my voice was hoarse and unsteady, but I forced myself to speak. "Was anyone else injured? Scratches? Bites? Was anyone in close proximity to that statue in the lab when it all started?" Captain Cole, who had been dozing in his seat, opened his eyes. His gaze was heavy, scrutinizing. Several soldiers exchanged glances. The silence in the bay became even more tense. "We all underwent preliminary decontamination aboard before takeoff, Richards," Cole said slowly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Standard protocols. We'll be met with full quarantine and medical examination on Earth." But there was no conviction in his voice. He avoided my gaze. One of the soldiers, a young man with barely there stubble, swallowed nervously. "Jenkins. One of the creatures pinned him in a corner in the life support sector," he said quietly. "He said it breathed in his face before we took it down. No scratches apparently, but..." He didn't finish, cutting himself short under the captain's stern gaze. At that moment, I felt it myself. First, a dull, aching pain in my shoulder and back muscles, spreading rapidly through my entire body. Then a wave of heat that made me break out in a sweat, followed by a sharp, bone-chilling cold. My head swam, everything swam before my eyes for a moment. I looked at my hands. My skin felt coarser, drier, my fingernails. They seemed to be thickening, took on a sort of grayish tint. I tried to clench my fist. My fingers moved with difficulty, as if my joints had turned to wood. "No," I whispered, but it was more a moan. "No, this can't be happening." Mike beside me let out a low, guttural sound like a growl. He grabbed first his stomach, then his head. His body began to convulse. His facial features distorted before my eyes, elongating, sharpening, the sound of his jumpsuit fabric tearing. The injured soldier across from me groaned loudly, his eyes rolled back, revealing bloodshot whites. A choked gasp tore from his throat and his fingers curled, turning into claws. "Secure the targets, immediately!" yelled Captain Cole, scrambling from his seat and trying to draw some weapon from the holster on his hip. But it was too late. The other soldiers also began showing signs of change. Convulsions, inhuman sounds, distorting faces. That same crimson predatory fire flared in their eyes. The smell of ozone and something wild, musky, filled the shuttle's cramped bay. I felt it happening to me too, relentlessly, inevitably. A burning pain pierced every cell of my body, bones broke and rearranged with a sickening crunch. A primal, blind rage flooded my consciousness, drowning out the last remnants of human thought, fears, memories. I looked at my hands. They were no longer human. Long, coarse, dark-furred fingers with black, sharp claws. Through the crimson haze clouding my vision, I saw in the viewport the shining, beautiful Earth. The blue planet. The cradle of humanity. So close and so defenseless. The last coherent thought piercing my transforming brain was a scream of despair, directed not at anyone specific, but at the entire cosmos. We are not bringing them salvation. We are bringing them doom. Is Earth doomed? The answer drowned in my own inhuman howl tearing from my chest, which merged with the roars and growls of the others, turning our rescue shuttle into a death arc hurtling towards Earth. The nightmare was just beginning.